You're watching Southern Crimes.
Scottsdale, Arizona, April 10th, 2001. At 8:42 in the morning, a house at 2223 North 74th Place detonated with enough force to blow out the back walls and rattle windows a half-mile away. Neighbors rushed outside as smoke billowed above the roofline. By the time firefighters arrived and began working through the wreckage, what they found inside turned this from a freak accident into something much darker. Inside the wreckage, investigators found Mary Fisher, 38, and her two children, Brittany, 12, and Bobby, 10. All three had been killed before the explosion, their throats slit with single precise cuts that reached the spine. Mary had also been shot in the back of the head. The house hadn't killed this family. It was simply used to conceal what had already been done. The fire had been set deliberately. Investigators determined that someone had pulled the gas line from the furnace and positioned a lit candle as a delayed ignition device. Gas accumulated for hours before it found the flame, enough time for whoever did this to be very far away. But the strange thing, the husband and father was nowhere to be found. His name was Robert Fisher. He was 39 years old, just 3 days shy of his 40th birthday. He was a surgical cath tech and respiratory therapist at Mayo Clinic Hospital. He was a Navy vet. Neighbors described him as devoted, disciplined, and deeply private. But he was also a man whose wife had recently told people she wanted a divorce. Mary's Toyota 4Runner was gone, his family was dead, and the house he'd lived in was burning. Robert Fisher hadn't just fled the scene. He'd engineered his disappearance with the same cold precision he applied to everything else in his life. And by the time the smoke cleared, the man investigators would spend the next 2 decades hunting had already vanished deep into the Arizona wilderness. This is Southern Crimes. To understand what happened inside that house on the night of April 9th, 2001, you have to understand who Robert Fisher was. Not the version he presented to the world, but the version that existed in private. Fisher was born on April 13th, 1961 in Brooklyn, New York. After his parents divorced, he moved to Arizona to live with his dad and 2 siblings. He joined the military and later bragged about attempting Navy SEAL training, though coworkers were never sure it was true. He worked as a firefighter before injuring his back, and then transitioned into medical technology, eventually building a career at Mayo Clinic Hospital. By suburban Scottsdale standards, his life was a success. But the home he maintained told a much different story. Fisher enforced a domestic environment of rigid, suffocating control. The walls were required to remain white, no colored paint, no family photos beyond the bare minimum he permitted, and he even refused to let his wife hang decorative quilts made by her own mother. He demanded dinner at 5 o'clock sharp. He refused to pay for air conditioning in the Arizona heat. He monitored his wife's exercise, once locking her out of the house and forcing her to complete a double walk because he refused to have a fat wife. There are varying reports, but the consensus is that Robert had at least one extramarital affair and possibly contracted a sexually transmitted infection from a more recent affair right before the murders, but more on that later. Those who knew the family described a man with a Jekyll and Hyde personality. In public, he was a devoted church-going family man, but behind closed doors, he was cruel and controlling. He chewed Copenhagen tobacco, drove pickup trucks, and hunted and fished with the easy confidence of a man who was completely at home in the outdoors. He was, by every outward measure, a good old boy who loved his family and his country. But the reality was something else. What really made Fisher difficult to read was the way he compartmentalized things in his life. In social settings, he always wanted to be the center of attention. He liked to be around people with interests in hunting, guns, and law enforcement. But the control he exercised at home left few visible marks on the version of himself he showed to the rest of the world. His neighbors didn't really have a reason to look closer. The mask only slipped occasionally at the Mayo Clinic, where he privately admitted his marital troubles and infidelity to a few colleagues. Overall, the mask was that good, but there was more to the story. Fisher's parents divorced when he was 15, and apparently it had affected him deeply. According to people who knew him well, it left a wound that never fully healed. In fact, he told associates he would never allow his children to experience a broken home. In his mind, divorce just wasn't an option. Just 36 hours before April 10th, Mary Fisher explicitly told a friend she intended to end her marriage. However, according to an investigation by the podcast Missing in Arizona, the marital strife was fueled by a volatile secret. Shortly before the murders, Mary discovered she'd contracted syphilis, which medical experts noted had likely progressed to the secondary stage. The podcast reports that because Mary was known to be faithful, the diagnosis strongly suggested Robert had cheated and transmitted the disease to her. According to the series, Mary's discovery of the infection and the proof of her husband's infidelity sparked a final confrontation between the couple. To Robert, this meant the marriage wasn't simply ending. It was ending in exposure and humiliation. For a man whose entire identity rested on control, on image, and on the carefully maintained fiction of the perfect family, this was something he couldn't survive. So, he chose a different kind of survival. The timeline of April 9th, 2001 is a portrait of a man executing a plan he'd been building for some time. Robert Fisher began his shift at Mayo Clinic Hospital at 7:30 in the morning. At 3:51 in the afternoon, he clocked out 2 minutes early, an unusual departure from his routine. At 4 p.m., he was seen leaving the hospital parking lot in his new silver Dodge Ram. That evening, he took Brittany to her National Junior Honor Society induction ceremony. Mary and Bobby were conspicuously absent, attending a hunting safety course across town. Witnesses who were present at the ceremony described Fisher as distant, disconnected. One witness even used the word creepy. At 7:55 p.m., on the way home from Brittany's induction ceremony, Fisher stopped at an outdoor shop and purchased water purification tablets, a pump filter, and other survival gear items. At 9:30 p.m., Mary and Bobby left the hunting safety class at Scottsdale Baptist Church, and the family eventually converged back at home. At approximately 10 p.m., a neighbor reported hearing a heated argument coming from the Fisher residence. While forensic analysis confirmed the victims died before the fire was set, investigators later established that the murders likely occurred in the early morning hours of April 10th. The argument the neighbor heard may have been the last sounds Mary Fisher ever made. At 10:42 p.m., Fisher was captured on ATM footage at a Chase bank, driving Mary's Toyota 4Runner. He withdrew $280, the maximum the machine would allow. His face was visible, his expression was flat. He looked like a man completing a transaction, not a man who'd just murdered or was planning to murder his family. Now, while establishment narratives long assumed Robert killed his family before the ATM trip, newer evidence, corroborated by a neighbor and a local delivery man, suggests he returned home and committed the murders in the quiet, early hours of the morning. But what is certain is that by the time Robert fled, the candle was already burning, the gas was already accumulating, and none of this was improvised. In fact, the evidence suggests Fisher had been laying the groundwork for his disappearance for months. According to Missing in Arizona, 9 days before the murders, Fisher had visited a survivalist compound in Paulden, Arizona. He actually left Mary in the car for an hour while he met with unknown individuals inside. Apparently, the area was known for outlaw biker activity. What Fisher was seeking in that meeting has never been established with certainty, but the timing is difficult to dismiss. 9 days before his family was murdered, he's sitting inside a compound associated with people who operated outside the boundaries of conventional society, people who understand how to move without leaving traces. Whether he was seeking documents, contacts, or simply knowledge, the visit represents one of the most troubling unanswered questions in the entire case, and that wasn't all. In December 2000, 4 months before the murders, Fisher had befriended an older man living completely off the grid near Clint's Well, a hermit in a small trailer, living with minimalistic efficiency and a stockpile of supplies invisible to the modern world. Fisher was reportedly fascinated by this man's existence. In hindsight, it seems like these weren't random encounters. Maybe it was research. On the evening of April 19, 2001, nearly 10 days after the fire, a transient camper named Greg spotted a glint of silver abandoned in the Tonto National Forest near Young, Arizona. The next morning, the family dog, Blue, approached him from the vehicle, porcupine quills embedded in his nose, whining and pacing in confused circles. Inside the unlocked Toyota 4Runner, investigators found Robert's black hat, the same one seen in the ATM camera footage, resting neatly on the passenger seat as if deliberately placed there. Greg reported the discovery to friends via a payphone, who then reported it to authorities. Greg then fled the state almost immediately. While establishment narratives long painted his sudden departure as a dark mystery, well, the truth was far simpler. Greg had a stash of marijuana in his van and hit the road to avoid police dogs sniffing it out. The search that followed was one of the most intensive in Arizona history. More than 100 law enforcement agents deployed into the rugged terrain of the Rim Country. Dozens of caves were searched, though the Gila County Sheriff later noted the intensive search grid covered just a 1.5-mile radius around the vehicle. When you consider that the surrounding Tonto National Forest is a 2.9 million acre expanse, well, the search grid was actually really small. Additionally, early media reports claimed footprints were tracked leading away from the scene, but this was a myth. The prints found a mile away were size 13, far too large for Fisher, and were likely left by a person hiking or scavenging elk antlers. That said, the vehicle was abandoned about 300 yards west of the Fort Apache Indian Reservation. The reservation sits on sovereign land, so by default, it was never searched as thoroughly as the surrounding federal territory. But despite the overall lack of physical evidence, a few leads did surface. A few days before Mary's abandoned 4Runner was found, a couple reported seeing a man walking toward Highway 260. When the woman spotted him, she reportedly remarked to her husband, "That looks like Robert Fisher." But because they didn't yet realize his vehicle had been abandoned nearby, they waited until after the 4Runner's discovery was publicized on April 20th to officially report the tip to law enforcement. Unfortunately, investigators found nothing conclusive. No body, no equipment, no trace of Robert Fisher beyond the 4Runner and the dog. And to be clear, Fisher's physical profile, it was pretty specific. 6 feet tall, approximately 190 pounds, an odd, erect gait caused by chronic back and knee pain, a gold tooth on the upper left first bicuspid, a surgical scar running down the midline of his lower back, size 8 to 10 feet, likely 9.5, a man who chewed Copenhagen tobacco and drove pickup trucks and felt comfortable in the kind of terrain that was now being searched for his remains. The FBI added Fisher to its 10 most wanted list. A $100,000 reward was offered for information leading to his capture. Tips came in from across the country and internationally: Mexico, Canada, Australia. Investigators processed between 10,000 and 20,000 leads over the following 2 decades, but in the end, None of them led to Robert Fisher. In the years that followed, the case generated significant investigative attention. A man resembling Fisher, including a similar surgical scar on his lower back and a missing tooth right where Fisher had a gold cap on his upper left first bicuspid, was arrested in White Rock, British Columbia in 2004. But fingerprint analysis eventually confirmed it wasn't him. Additionally, tourists reported a hostile encounter with a man resembling Fisher in Guatemala in 2009. From what I can tell, that lead was never confirmed, but that's not all. According to the podcast, one of the more compelling early leads involved a man named Brian Ballard, known by the nickname Purebred. Reports emerged that Fisher may have stayed with Ballard in the immediate aftermath of the murders. Ballard was a drywall contractor with known ties to drug use and, critically, connections to counterfeit cash and checks. The podcast theorizes that if Fisher had accessed Ballard's underground network, he may have obtained the kind of falsified identity documents necessary to assume an entirely new life. In November 2021, the FBI removed Fisher from its 10 most wanted list. Not because the case was closed, not because he'd been found, but because 19 years of intensive publicity had failed to generate actionable leads, and the slot was considered better used for a different fugitive. That said, he remains wanted at the state and federal level. The question that has defined this case for over 2 decades is deceptively simple. Is Robert Fisher alive? Well, the statistical answer is uncomfortable. 80 to 85% of family annihilators die by either at the scene or shortly after. What's interesting is that Fisher had reportedly threatened that in 1999. The psychological profile of a man who kills his family and then vanishes into the wilderness fits a pattern that most often ends with a body that's eventually found. But Fisher's body has never been found. Forensic anthropologists and investigators familiar with the Rim County note something significant. In the years since Fisher's disappearance, numerous bodies have been recovered in that terrain. Skeletal remains, even when scattered by animals, typically yield DNA or distinctive physical markers. A gold tooth on the upper left first bicuspid, for example, it doesn't decompose, it doesn't disappear. It sits in the soil and waits to be found. Yet Fisher's gold tooth has never been found. The argument for survival rests on several pillars. Fisher was an experienced outdoorsman and Navy veteran with decent wilderness skills. He'd been planning his disappearance for months, possibly longer. He'd visited a survivalist compound 9 days before the murders. He'd befriended a man living completely off the grid. He'd withdrawn cash. He'd even made a public show of purchasing survival gear the evening of the murders, planting the final seeds of his escape. There's also the matter of timing. Fisher vanished in April 2001, just as the modern surveillance state was beginning to take shape. Facebook didn't exist. iPhones didn't exist. Ring cameras didn't exist. The last confirmed imagery of him was grainy ATM footage. In 2001, that window for disappearance was still open in a way it simply wouldn't be today. He chose his moment, whether deliberately or by circumstance, with remarkable precision. The psychological profile also matters here. Investigators who've studied Fisher's case classify him as a self-preserving family annihilator rather than one motivated by misguided altruism. The distinction is significant. Self-preserving annihilators view their families as possessions to be shed when they become inconvenient. They kill to start over, not to end everything. And they're statistically less likely to die by their own hand than other subtypes. 15 to 20% of family annihilators successfully flee. Fisher's profile places him squarely in that category. Fisher, under this framework, didn't kill his family because he wanted to die. He killed them because he wanted to live differently, a new geographic location, maybe as someone else. If Fisher is alive, investigators believe he's most likely living under an assumed identity in a rural or semi-rural environment, working in a trade that requires physical skill but minimal documentation. Construction, landscaping, mechanical work, the kind of labor that suits a man with his background and keeps him away from the government systems that require real ID verification or fingerprinting. He'd probably be avoiding social media entirely. He'd be living in a community where people ask few questions and value their own privacy enough to extend the same courtesy to others. He'd be, in other words, hiding in plain sight, not in a cave, not in the wilderness, in a life that looks from the outside pretty ordinary. Modern investigative tools have been brought to bear on the case in recent years, largely driven by independent journalists and the Missing in Arizona podcast. After heavily criticizing the FBI's official age-progressed photos, the podcast commissioned forensic artists to produce new images based on candid photographs from 1997 and 1999. The artists focused heavily on Fisher's distinctive eyes and what those who knew him described as a smirky, diabolical smile. Using 11 minutes of salvaged home movie audio, the podcast team also used AI technology to clone Fisher's voice, giving the public a cutting-edge tool for identifying him by sound as well as appearance. Because law enforcement is pretty restricted by privacy laws and corporate regulations from using commercial databases like Ancestry and 23andMe, the podcast has publicly encouraged Fisher's extended family to voluntarily submit their DNA. Any children Fisher may have fathered in a new life, under a new name, in a new state or country, could generate a familial ping in those databases that finally leads the world back to him. Robert Fisher would be 65 years old today. If he is alive, he spent more than 2 decades living as someone else, in some configuration of existence that has kept him invisible to one of the most sustained manhunts in American law enforcement history. He'd most likely be dealing with the chronic back and knee pain that gave him his distinctive gait. His physical condition would make long-term survival in the wilderness or a demanding manual labor existence increasingly difficult with each passing year. He'd potentially be dependent on opioids or other pain management. He'd be aging in a body that was already compromised when he disappeared. If he is dead, forensic experts note it's highly unlikely his remains are sitting undiscovered in the heavily trafficked federal forest. Instead, if he did die in the wilderness, he likely crossed the nearby boundary onto the Fort Apache Indian Reservation, sovereign land that was never searched thoroughly. Either answer is disturbing in its own way, but what's easy to get lost in this story are the human beings that Robert Fisher killed and the people that loved them. Mary Fisher was 38 years old. Brittany was 12. Bobby was 10. They were killed in their beds, in their home, by the man who was supposed to protect them. The house was then set to explode around them, an act investigators theorize wasn't about destroying forensic evidence, but rather a violent purge to incinerate his past, intentionally destroying all photographs and videos that could have been used to track him down in his new life. Somewhere, Robert Fisher is either dead in the Arizona wilderness or alive in a life he built on the ashes of the one he destroyed. The answer's out there. The only question is, will it ever be found?